So, Curt, for people who are not familiar with this story, and I have to say it is a really incredibly disturbing story, just take us back to I think people are probably broadly familiar with the fact that in his first term, Governor Snyder of Michigan signed a bill which essentially allowed him to appoint unelected managers of various cities in Michigan to essentially function as mayor. The mayor would still be around, but with no powers. And this was the case in Flint, Michigan. Pick up the story from there. Who was the city manager at that time?
Well, it's actually a little bit. These appointed emergency managers have much more power than any elected mayor or city council has. They have complete authority. They can create new ordinances. They can abolish old ordinances. They can take away health care benefits for retirees. They can break collective bargaining agreements. So their authority is much more extensive. And the elected officials who are there, they only have as much authority as the emergency manager chooses to give them. It's the most extreme receivership law in the United States. So that's
this means that they can override the city council. They can override existing laws. I mean, do they?
Yep.
Is there any even restraint from the judiciary on them? I would imagine some.
Yes, and there is one restraint in the law. The law says that they can't miss a bond payment.
Huh.
So they can do just about everything else that they want to do. They just can't miss a bond payment. They got to make sure that the banks are paid. That's part of their job. But they can sell off assets. Really, they can do just about anything that they want. And so if there's an inconvenient city ordinance that's stopping them from doing something, they can just abolish the city ordinance. So then that gives you an idea of the extent of the power that these appointed people have.
Before we go into the specifics of Flint,
yes.
Has there been any federal challenge to this, or is this simply this is the nature of the Michigan Constitution?
No, there is a challenge in federal court. It's a couple years now, but it's difficult because essentially the cities, school districts are creatures of the state. They exist because the state charters them and allows them to exist. And so the rationale is, well, if you can create them, you can take them over. It's not necessarily interpretation that I think is a good interpretation, but that's the legal theory that they used in passing this law.
And lastly, can you tell me some of the various cities that have been subject to this? And is it a function of ostensibly some type of bankruptcy or what? What is the triggering mechanism?
It's the state's determination that cities, school districts, counties, although it hasn't happened to any counties yet, that they're in a financial stress, extreme financial stress, and so they have a sort of metric and use and come in and evaluate. Though the way the law has been applied in Michigan, it's been, with one exception, of all cities and school districts that have a majority African-American populations. So there's very much a racist aspect to the application of this law. And they're also very poor cities. Flint, for example, has a poverty rate of about 40%. Although one of the things that pushed them over the edge was the cutback in revenue sharing, a decision made in order to give a tax break to corporations. They cut back on revenue sharing with cities.
And by revenue sharing, you're basically talking about states that provided some extra funds.
Correct.
They cut off that funding to provide tax breaks, and then turned around and said, now that you don't have that funding, you fit in nicely to the algorithm that we have developed, which is also in and of itself, I guess, is fairly subjective, and then we can take you over essentially, and put in what amounts to a this is like installing a manager at the Denny's, right? There is no accountability to anybody except for, in this case, the governor.
The governor appoints him. Yeah, critics call it the emergency dictator law. That's pretty much the expanse of the power that they have. There's very little checks on their authority, and they are answerable to the governor who appoints them, and not to the people who they're supposed to be serving.
And I will say, I mean, I think when people hear this, they find it offensive simply to the way that we do democracy in this country. And I think this story of Flint, Michigan, shows how, in fact, this is not only an offense to the theoretical idea of a democracy, but it shows what happens when you have unaccounted elected officials with this amount of power, that it can literally be deadly, that it can literally destroy the lives of children and of families for what could ultimately be literally generations. Let's talk about this. So,
just one other thing is that it's also, so along with denial of democracy, installing an autocracy, it's also the pursuit of austerity, of which is becoming more and more of an issue, given the what's going on economically in a lot of parts of the country. So when you have to pay the bankers for this immense amount of debt that a lot of places have, this is austerity at work.
All right, so tell us the story of Flint. A city manager is appointed by Governor Rick Snyder, and who was that city manager, and what did they proceed to do?
Well, actually, there's been a series of 4 emergency managers had control over Flint. And the way the law is written is, because these emergency managers have so much power, the claim was, they're going to be able to come in, clean up the mess that was created, and get out of Dodge. Except that that's not the way it worked out, and so that the 18-month time limit that was supposed to be in place, their way around that was an emergency manager would serve for 17 months and 29 days, and one day before their term expired, they would resign, and then a new one would be appointed, and the clock starts ticking again for another 18 months, which is why the emergency manager that was over Flint, when the decision was finalized to begin using the river, he's now the emergency manager over Detroit public schools, where, the debt has increased while under emergency management. The last time I looked, the debt while under state control had increased about $500 million. And so a guy that was directly involved in a decision that led to the lead poisoning of children is now in charge of the well-being of the 45,000 students that remain in Detroit public schools.
And folks can, with a little bit of work, can find plenty that has been written on the inefficiency of this system, the failures of competency that we've seen in these shuffling around of these emergency managers. But you touched on this aspect of the story that is, I think, has got people so outraged, and it is so, in many respects, unbelievable, which is that the Michigan state government, via its emergency manager, has actually poisoned and has done so for a significant period of time in the face of community criticism and complaints and of data and whatnot. They have poisoned their own citizens. And we've got to take a break, but when we come back, I want you to tell us this story of how Flint ended up, in pursuit of saving a few dollars, has actually poisoned its children. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with Curt Guyette right after this. So, Curt, at the break, you had told us about this law in Michigan, which has allowed Governor Rick Snyder to appoint emergency managers in specific positions throughout Michigan, whether it's as a sort of an emergency city manager, or whether it's an emergency school manager of specific cities, that the all but one of the cities that he has appointed emergency managers to have been predominantly African American. They are poor cities. And there have been a series of emergency managers who have basically had dictatorial powers in the city of Flint. At one point, one of these city managers, in a means to save money, decided that they were going to disconnect themselves from the city of Detroit water system. Tell us about that decision, why it was made, when it was made, and what was supposedly going to replace it.
Well, there's a little bit involved, but while under emergency management, a decision was made to participate in building a new water pipeline from Lake Huron to Genesee County, where Flint's located. Flint's about 70 miles northwest of Detroit. They'd been getting water from Detroit for 50 years. Detroit terminated a long-term contract, but only because they were restructuring their water rates and wanted to keep selling water to Flint. Flint decided to join this pipeline consortium, and in the interim, until the pipeline was completed, in order to save $5 million over a 2-year period, they decided to start using and only the emergency manager decided to start, maybe under the direction from the governor, we don't know that yet, decided to start using the Flint River as the city's municipal water source. And it was purely an economically driven decision, although they claimed falsely that Detroit kicked them off the system. That's simply not true, but that was a way to cover themselves because it made them not responsible for the decision to use the river by saying that they were forced to. They repeatedly told that lie, and at many different levels of government, but including one of the emergency managers told the public that lie. And so in this economically derivative decision to begin using the river, as soon as they switched over in April of 14, there began to be a series of problems because the water, it's much more difficult to treat the river water than it is the very clean lake water that Detroit had been supplying for 50 years. First, they had an E. coli problem and a series of boil water notices in the summer of 14. In order to deal with the E. coli problem, they upped the amount of chlorine that they were using, which then created a carcinogenic byproduct called total trihalomethanes, which went on for months and months and months before they bothered to tell the people that they were above legal limits for this carcinogenic byproduct of chlorine, because they really didn't know what they were doing. They never had to really run a water treatment plant because the water from Detroit was already being treated. So would pump it up to Flint. They'd add a little chlorine in Flint and then send it on its way. They go from that to having this very complicated job of treating this river water, which changes all the time, changes based on the temperature, the time of year. In the spring, when there's runoff from the snow and there's salt in it, it changes the chemical content of the river. And so they just were totally ill-prepared, and they just kept sort of bumbling from one mistake to another, and trying to correct one mistake, they would cause another problem. But the issue became that the Flint River is very highly corrosive, at least 5 times more corrosive than the water they were getting from Detroit. On top of it being much more corrosive, inexplicably, the state made the decision to stop adding the kind of corrosion control chemicals that Detroit routinely applies. And so when they needed corrosion control more than ever because the water was so much more corrosive, they inexplicably stopped using it. And that decision, because of that decision, the water, which has very, very high salt content, just began tearing up the pipes. And there's old iron pipes and then a lot of homes, the service line, which runs from the water main that goes down the middle of the street to the house. The pipe that connects those two is the service line. And in a lot of these older homes, they're made of lead. And so because they weren't using the corrosion control, the kind of what's called a biofilm that had been built up and keeps the lead particles adhered to the pipes rather than allowing it to leach into the water, that biofilm got destroyed, and the high levels of lead began leaching into the water going into people's homes, and people started to get lead poisoned, but didn't know about it. It went for months and months and months without them knowing about it.
And if people are unaware, lead poisoning in children is irreversible. It is it is a known
neurotoxin. It's a very potent neurotoxin that lowers IQs, causes learning disabilities, and behavioral problems. And this is not that well
This
known.
is uncontroversial, but this is uncontroversial. I mean, this has been known for years. It's why we have outlawed lead paint. It is why we have gone on that. And so we have
no more lead in gasoline. Yeah, it's it's not just kids, but it's particularly harmful to kids and pregnant moms. And this is one of the really, really distressing things. There's new evidence showing that it is transmitted generationally.
And so, look, we only have one more minute left here. And so what people should understand is this is both a story of total incompetence on behalf of this regime, but the second half of this story is there was complaints after complaints after complaints. Outside experts were brought in. There were lies that were being told by the Michigan Environmental
Quality. Yes.
And they were telling it to these people, and at the end of the day, there was not a single politician who was in a position to do anything about this who was accountable to the voters of Flint, Michigan, and that is why it was allowed to continue like this. There was no accountability.
Correct. And actually there was conflict of interest because the governor appoints the emergency manager, the governor appoints the director of environmental quality, and so there's no independent checks and balances. One of the keystones to a functioning democracy. All that makes democracy work was taken away from the people of Flint, and the MDEQ was continuing to tell people the water was safe when it was known that it was not safe, and so they denied there was a problem when they knew a problem existed, and so more people got exposed to high levels of lead as a result of that dishonesty.
Thousands of lives destroyed, and even to this day, we're not getting clean water. The state is not providing clean water. For this week, Rick Snyder said, well, the one good thing is that we see that there's a demand for this water now. It is one of the most repulsive stories, and the idea that there aren't people walking in shackles in that Michigan State House that aren't being marched out at this point is stunning to me. But we have to wrap it up. This story is obviously not going away, and hopefully the federal government will step in because there's been a clear violation, it seems to me, of these people's civil rights in the case, and to incredibly detrimental effects. But Curt Guyette, thank you so much for your time today, and I appreciate your work on this.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me on and helping to spread the word about this really horrible man-made crisis.
Thank you, Curt.